Oh, well, here we are again. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back again to the Fat Paramotor podcast. I'm Shaun, Fat Paramotor Guy, and of course we've got Daniel Jones again, co-hosting again. Well, today we've got a great podcast for you. We're going to be talking today about Paramotor Safety. Is paramotoring safe? What do you think? Daniel, what do you think? Is paramotoring safe?
We could sum this up in a few little words, Shaun, but what is safe?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because nothing is safe, is it? Nothing is safe at all. You know, even picking flowers in your garden is not safe. So I guess we talk about relative safety, don't we? You know, is an acceptable risk. That's another word that we could use there. Nothing's ever going to be safe. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You know, there's you could do a normal everyday thing, and all of a sudden some freak accident happens, and that thing then is unsafe, I guess, to a degree. I read a news article not that long ago where there was a guy, I think he was with his family, and he did a roly-poly off the half in front of his open fire, and he paralysed himself from the neck down. Just by doing a roly-poly.
A roly-poly, mate. I've never heard that phrase before. How cute. No, absolutely. Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, everything carries risk in life, but it's acceptable risk. And I think the important thing about risk is to have some idea of the level of risk. You know, and I always say this, it's like people who free climb. You know, these crazy people who will climb up a building or up a mountain and don't wear any safety gear at all or anything like that. And you can call these people crazy, but at the end of the day, they understand the risks of what they do, and they're prepared to take that risk. But in order to take risk, to make decisions about these things, you've got to kind of have some idea about how risky something is. And paramotoring is one of those things that every time I tell people that I fly a paramotor or try to fly a paramotor, people always look at me with horror, as if to say, "God, you're a madman."
Yeah, I get the same reaction. But is it that risky? You know, people see you hanging from a few strings, but there's been so much design go into the wings to make them more safe, especially nowadays when we've got, you know, the reflex profiles coming in, which are, you know, more stable in turbulent air, as opposed to paragliders where they'd have to actively pilot. You are getting more and more safer equipment the more technology develops.
Yeah, that's true. So, you know, I mean, part of what's happening with any sport is kind of increasing the safety profile. And I know here in the UK, that's one of the things that the BHPA are interested in. It's analysing things and increasing the safety. So there is a push towards safety, but I guess we've got to kind of think about, you know, what kind of things happens then when you're flying a paramotor. What's your experience, and what's the things that worry you the most when you're flying?
I think my worries have sort of subsided a little bit since my first beginning sort of years, I suppose. I've been flying for about a year and a half now, as we've alluded to in other podcasts. But I think now that I've flown more, I fear things less because I understand them. So I'll just talk about one of my more memorable flights from when I was quite low hours. I went up in some choppy air, and I will be honest, it did scare me a bit, and it was probably one of my worst flights that I can remember. But actually, if I'd have flown in that air now, I think my tolerance levels would have been much higher, and it wouldn't have scared me as much. I think probably one of the things I fear the most is actually sort of at busy airfields, at fly-ins, when people can come at you from any direction. And just recently I've been back to the airfields, and when it is busy, you know, you can't expect that person to avoid you. You have to fly quite defensively. And I think out of all the times I do fly, that's probably the highest risk, unless I'm trying maybe say like an acro maneuver or something like that. But that's a separate matter altogether.
Yeah. Okay. So because what I wanted to kind of cover in this podcast is there's going to be sort of two elements to it here, Dan. I mean, one, you know, let's talk about experience, our own fears, the things that we've seen and things like that. And then what I want to do a little bit later on is just actually look at some of the statistics see whether these back up some of our fears and things, and maybe back up some of the fears of listeners regarding paramotoring. I do have some statistics. I've looked at some of the information from the BHPA. I've also read a couple of papers. There's a couple of papers from my own industry, which is medicine, emergency medicine, and talking about sort of injury and stuff. We'll get into those. But yeah, I pick up there, you're talking about the sort of the fear of mid-air collision. Mid-air collisions, they're quite worrying. And it's one of the things I know when I did my training that you're constantly being taught to have some awareness of, that idea that you're always looking around for other aircraft in the sky, and even things like, if you're going to be turning left, for example, and this is one of the things I learned in light aviation as well as paramotoring. If you're going to make a left-hand turn, you would bank right first so you can see underneath the left wing, and then turn left, because otherwise you blind yourself by your own wing in the left-hand turn. So that's awareness of other things in the sky, and that is something that would cause me concern. Have you seen those guys when they're paragliding, Dan? Sometimes it's like 1,000 of them all circling these thermals and things. Looks pretty frightening to me. Huh?
That freaks me out, just how close they can possibly be. And if you're flying at that level, you must have a certain degree of skill. But if one of those people hits someone else, the chance of then taking out other people is probably quite high. So it's not likely going to be 2 people involved. It's going to be 3 or 4 when they're that close.
One of the local areas that I lived at once, they had a death there. That was actually from people who were parachuting, and the death actually came because there was a mid-air collision. Can you believe it? 2 people jumped out of an aeroplane, and all that space in the sky ended up hitting each other. But it was amazing how a mid-air collision resulted in the deaths of both people. So that's quite worrying to me, having sort of a strike mid-air. And every time I've seen something on YouTube, and you have to be very, very careful, Dan, because there is a bias in accident reporting, because we all like to see the grisly and the gruesome. Nobody likes to see a video that's titled "Safe Landing." Everybody likes to watch the one, skydiver or paramotor dies, in mid-air collision and things. But every time I see these mid-air collisions, they look pretty scary to me, and often the results can be quite tragic.
Yeah, they definitely look dramatic, and you're right. It's people's morbid curiosity that draws them into watching those videos, and if you were to put the 2 together, like you say, the one with the accident would get more views. Now, some people want to analyze that and understand why it happened, and others are just curious to see what actually happened. And
no, absolutely. And I think analysis of these things is key. I mean, that is something people like the BHPA and sort of other sporting associations are interested in, because every accident is the opportunity to learn from that accident and try and prevent somebody else from having the same thing. So reflective learning, we tend to call that, is, sort of reflectively learn not only by your own mistakes, but also from the mistakes of other people. And I've seen, there's been a little bit of, there's been a bit out there in social media as well. I know some people have reviewed the accidents of other people to try and make sense over the cause of the injury and things. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Tucker Gott does a lot of his reacting to crash videos. I think you can look at that in a couple of lights, really. One of them being the skeptic side of me is, he's going for more views. But the other side of it is he actually does sit down and analyzes those accidents to hopefully teach people to look out for these problems that can occur. And usually they're pilot error, they've clipped in wrong, or they've been caught out in high winds, or it has been a mid-air collision. So I think him having the audience that he does, and other people who analyze their videos, such like I do as well, it does help a community learn and develop their skills. So hopefully that'll be taken on board, and things do become safer through knowledge and not just the equipment, like I alluded to earlier.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Knowledge is key sometimes, isn't it, in understanding how these things go wrong and trying to prevent them from happening yourself. Sometimes they do instill fear, though. I'll be honest with you. I think when I first started paramotoring, I had no fear at all. And the more videos I watch, the more fearful I tend to get. I'll tell you the thing that worries me the most about watching these things. It's, okay, when it's pilot error, you can learn from that. And, you know, you can think, well, I'm going to make sure I don't make those mistakes when I'm flying a paramotor. But the things that scare me is the things I worry about people not having control over. That's the real thing that scares me. You know, I think, could I be flying along doing everything right, and then could something catastrophic happen that's absolutely no fault of my own? And that's one of the things that brings me a little bit of anxiety, because if I feel as though I'm in control, I don't feel so scared. If I feel as I've got no control at all and this wing could collapse at any minute, that is something that brings me a level of anxiety.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I had a great amount of confidence instilled in me from my wing just recently through trying a few acro maneuvers. You know, I'm starting to progress in my flying. And this is kind of where, you know, is paramotoring safe begs the question, because I'm pushing the envelope of what would be a safe flight to try and do something that, you know, is a bit out of the ordinary. So I was doing some wing overs, and I've sent you a video, Shaun. I don't know if you want to just play that and have a look through and see what your reaction is to, is paramotoring safe in that viewpoint.
So nice bit of a woohoo there. There's no feeling like knowing you're still alive and you shouldn't be. So anybody that's listening just watched a clip of a video there. Is that you, Dan, then doing wing overs? And
yeah, this is me from last weekend. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So took a sort of an asymmetric collapse. The left side of the wing collapsed
into a downward spiral, and then the other tip collapsed as well.
The first thing that I'll say there, just looking at the video, Dan, my first thoughts on that is it looks awfully low. I mean, maybe that's just me, but you look quite low to the ground to start with. How high were you there?
So I was about 3,500 feet there.
Okay.
So I'd got in my head that that's what I was going to go up to do.
Yeah.
And I made sure that I definitely had enough altitude. If I was going to throw my reserve, I was going to float downwind back towards pretty much where the airfield was. So I was going to be closer to sort of civilization as it was in Lincolnshire, being that it's pretty much agricultural fields. And I knew what maneuver I was doing, and there was no one about. I'd done a proper good look round, made sure the airframe and everything was correct. So in a sense, I made that as safe as I possibly could. However, doing those maneuvers is not recommended by any wing manufacturer. It's, you know, wings are designed to go straight and level, and then I think anything past that, like acro maneuvers, you know, that's an uncertified maneuver. I might be wrong in that, but you know, I'm taking an activity out of its comfort zone, of it, as it were. But I've made it as safe as I possibly could.
There's a couple of things I think there. I mean, if you're doing acro, there's an elevated amount of risk involved in it. But I think that's some of the excitement that people get. It's like people on a motorcycle who decide to do wheelies down the road or bomb around at 100 miles per hour on a racetrack or whatever. It's done because there's increased adrenaline because of the increased risk. I would say as well that when it comes to doing acro, you are pushing the limits of what you're doing to the extreme on purpose, and it's to kind of know the limits of what you're going to do. And when you're learning to acro, you are going to over push things, and things like that are going to happen. So the way that I actually see that myself, Dan, is I think anybody who is interested in doing any kind of acro should expect to have that kind of thing happen.
Yeah.
Which I guess is why you make sure you have the reserve, and I think even I've heard people talk about having 2 reserves if you're doing acro, that you should be at the right height and you take all the precautions, because If you don't get a collapse, then you've not really pushed the envelope, perhaps, of what you're capable of doing, which is why most people do it. So we're ameliorating risk there. We're trying to, aren't we? We're doing something a little bit more risky.
Yeah.
And I say we, that's the royal we. That was you, Dan. I'm not doing that, you mad sod. But you're going to ameliorate that risk with certain safety procedures, like like reserves, doing things at altitude, and perhaps also having the right wing to do that and things. I'm not an expert on wings. I thought it was a Dudek. What rated wing was it?
So that's the Dudek WRC 27 meter, and I think it's rated at C, if I'm not mistaken. But the problem is that the maneuvers I was doing, and this is where all my other mitigation sort of got a bit let down by actually my wing choice. I'm very, very light on that wing, being that I weigh in with my Paramotor and about 5 litres of fuel. I weigh in about 95 kg. The bottom of that weight range, I think, is about 90. So I'm right at the bottom end. It's a very floaty wing, but I fly it for the economy. It's not designed realistically for doing any acro maneuvers. I'd be better off on the Roadster 1 that I have, that I'm actually at the higher end of the weight range, which is a bit more of a paraglider profile. So if it collapses, it's going to pop out a bit more. Whereas WRC, being a reflex profile, if it has a collapse, and as you've just seen going into a nose down spiral, it collapsed quite dramatically. But that's likely through my poor piloting skill and not actually pulling off wing overs as best as I could. Why it did collapse.
It's interesting because when I did my paramotor training, as I said before, we were actually taught to fly paragliders initially, and then it progressed to sort of paramotoring, or there was a big element of paragliding in the course, and the course I think it was initially aimed at paragliders, and taking collapses, asymmetric collapses amongst paragliders tends to be something that also happens fairly regular. But the danger, the way that I was taught it, is not so much collapsing and hitting the ground. It's more the alteration of course. And so what can happen is if you're trying to fly around the mountain, using the compression zone as a paraglider, you take a collapse of your wing, it can steer you into the mountain or even into somebody else. So a lot of the things that we were taught were really more about course correction. The wing collapses, you correct your course, you keep the wing straight and level, and then you sort out the collapse, or it sorts itself out. This is one of the things I think is kind of borne out by some statistics that we'll talk about a little bit later. Is that a lot of accidents appear to be caused by people pushing the limits, and a lot of the deaths tend to be caused by people pushing the limits at low altitude. And this is the issue. I think we've talked about this before personally, Dan, haven't we? In that there's something strange that happens with the psyche. It feels safe to be close to the ground, but and feels more scary to be higher. But in actual fact, those things are completely the wrong way around. Safety is at altitude, because if anything happens at altitude, there is plenty of time to sort it out, or for it to sort itself out. Whereas if anything happens at low altitude, there's no time at all. You're at the mercy of fate.
Yeah, and it's a lot of luck involved at that point. You really, really do need to know exactly what's going to happen when you pull a certain brake line or tip steer or anything down low, because like you're saying, we have definitely covered that you feel safer being about 500 foot up because you are closer to the ground. It's probably because it's what you're used to, walking around and driving a car and stuff, when actually, like my event just then, 3,500 feet, it felt like 8 to 10 seconds in the air. It was realistically about 2 seconds, but had so much time because I had the height. It's you are so much safer up high for things like that. But I think it's the adrenaline thing that gets people going when they're close to the ground.
there's also a bit of a show off, isn't it, that's involved, I think. The times I've seen it, somebody takes off in his paramotor and his attractive girlfriend's watching from the ground. And as soon as he's off, he's banking that hard turn, and all looking sort of very spectacular, whooping and those kind of things. But it's those kind of antics, I think, that are more dangerous. Now, I won't criticize anybody for doing that, because I won't. People make their own choices. But I think, again, we've alluded to this in previous podcasts, that if you are doing that, if you are doing low-level antics, steep banks, all that kind of thing, you have to understand that the risk is high. If you want to take that risk, that's completely fine. And I wouldn't question you for doing that. But it's important that you understand that, I believe, as a paramotor pilot, that these low-level activities do carry more risk of death with them, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that as well, I think that the people that are going to do low-level stuff, and I'm guilty of myself of doing foot drags and stuff like that, you do also need to understand that you might actually be imposing your risk profile onto other people if it's a busy area. There was a video posted on the Facebook group very recently of a pilot on a free ride coming in and doing a wingtip touch. Impressive maneuver, but that person actually flew through their wake, took a tip collapse, and then smashed into the ground. They were so close to people and so close to a road that they were extremely lucky that they didn't kill or maim anyone else in the area. I think they walked away from it, but it's I think people need to be aware of that risk profile being projected onto bystanders as well.
Now, this brings me on to something very, very interesting, and you're absolutely right. Maybe when a person is flying in that manner, was aware of the risk to his or herself, and that's fine, but might not have been aware of the risk to other people, because the reason I mention this is an interesting statistic, and that is that people who fly tandem, paramotors and paragliders, because the statistics don't really separate, I don't believe, but people who fly tandem flights are far less likely to have an injury or a death than people who fly single. And the reason that is suggested is that people who fly tandem are aware of the safety of the soul that's on board. So, when you're flying with somebody else, you kind of, I don't mind taking risks with my own life, but I've got somebody else strapped in with me now, and therefore I'm not going to be taking any risks. I'm going to make sure everything's fine. So that's quite an interesting statistics, and that would suggest to me then, if those statistics bear out, that a lot of accidents that happen with solo pilots are happening because they are taking risks that they would not find acceptable if they had somebody else's life in their hands.
I think that's right, mate. When you take a tandem passenger up for a flight, and I'm yet to do it. I'd love to learn how to do tandem flights later in my flying career. But you're likely not going to scare the shit out of them as well. If it's their first flight, you're probably going to go for a nice straight and level. The wind conditions going to be lovely as well, and you're going to take a trip out to the coast, if the coast is near you, that is, and just have a nice bimble around, which is fundamentally what paramotoring is in its safest form. We're not flying in midday thermals or anything like that, even though, like you say, paragliders, they'll probably launch from, I think in Turkey, they do a lot of tandem flights as well, but I think they use a lot of ridge lift, if I'm correct. But still, it's done on the safer end of things. And if you have got that person in front of you, I think you're a bit more conscious of them.
Well, the statistic comes from a paper. So this is from the World Journal of Emergency Medicine, 2015, and the paper is called "The Characteristics of Injuries Caused by Paragliding Accidents," and it's a cross-sectional study. And one of the results of that study was that the rate of paragliding accidents is significantly higher in individual flights than in tandem flights, and that has a P number, if anybody knows about statistical significance, of less than 0.05, which suggests that it is a statistically significant finding. And it's alluded to, people tend to make unnecessary acrobatic moves when flying as an individual, which maximizes the risk of an accident. So I thought that was quite interesting. So, maybe if you want to fly safe, then maybe we should all carry somebody with us, eh?
Or just imagine you've got someone with you as well. If you can't find someone to rope into your flying,
Yeah. That's a good idea, mate. Yeah, that's a good idea. Just pretend that you've got somebody with you. I know it was always kind of a key performance indicator, a measure. When I learned to fly private aircraft, I remember the examiner at the time, when I was in my general flight test, saying that the marker set by the CAA is that you had, as an examiner, to be able to declare that you were happy for that person to fly with a member of your family with them. And there's a good marker, isn't it? That sort of that level of safety and things. Did you know as well? Now, I've looked, the BHPA, that's British, for anybody that knows, our sort of British Hang Gliding and Paramotoring or Paragliding Association, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, paragliding.
Yeah. That the number of accidents is actually increasing. Did you know that, Dan?
I didn't know that as fact, but it doesn't surprise me with the amount of people I've seen uptake in the sport since I've started. The sport's been going for quite some years now. I couldn't give you an exact date, but definitely in the time that I've been flying, the uptake seems to be quite a lot.
Yeah. I will say at this point now, I will thank the BHPA for providing statistics and some data analysis. I will say kindly to the BHPA because I do appreciate what's done, but the level of analysis on the data that they've got is actually pretty poor. It's quite difficult to read through their stuff and actually take anything away from it that's clinically or statistically significant and things. It was quite a difficult reading their accident reports, and they do make quite a few biased statements where they don't actually understand the data that they're presenting themselves. But as I said, I won't beat them up too much because very grateful for what they do and stuff. But yes, they reported 2018. That's the latest statistics. I think we've got new statistics due to be coming out soon. But there were 203 reported accidents in total, and 138 of those resulted in injuries, if I'm right there. They do say, the BHPA say, that they've seen this increase in accidents, but they don't make any claims to know the reason for the increase. But they have alluded to a couple of things. One is the increase in the uptake of the sport. Now, this is one of the reasons that I find the paper difficult to analyse, because they don't actually tell you the numbers of membership on this paper. It might be there somewhere in their site. I did have a quick look. I couldn't find it. But I don't know what the increase in membership has been. Now, increase in membership of the BHPA is not the same number as the number of people who are flying paramotors or paragliders, for example, but it is a representative proportion. You can allude that, or you can infer that if the number of pilots who are registered with the BHPA is doubled, then the number of paramotor pilots is likely doubled as well. It's a weak association, but you could make that that statement. But they don't tell you, so I can't see how many more pilots they've actually got and whether that is proportionally representative. But there's another statistic as well. You might be interested in this, Dan, or another reason that they're also suggesting that cross-country flying is becoming more popular. Therefore, pilots are increasing their flying hours, which is increasing the number of accidents.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I mean, I certainly am very keen cross-country pilot myself. I don't know why the trend has led to that sort of flying style. I would have thought that, if you are flying early hours of the day or in the evening, flying cross country, regardless of the hours, it's usually the launch and land where you're going to do any sort of damage or have an accident, unless you're flying in like mountainous terrain, maybe, which could cause other issues. Fortunately, Lincolnshire is quite flat where I do most of my flying, so I haven't really got to worry about that. But especially in like springtime as well, I suppose you've got the thermals that pick up, and that'll catch you out after a bit of a layoff over winter. But I would have thought, generally cross-country flying is a bit more safer than the general just having a wang about an airfield. Maybe. I might be wrong. Hopefully you've got some stats on that, Shaun, have you? Or
Well, no, but this is interesting. You see, this is where, the data is kind of missing. There's a big part of me, because I like numbers and figures, makes me wonder whether they ought to give me their statistics. Because I love these kind of things. But you're absolutely right. So, they've made this implication that increase in flying hours might be, they've not said that it is, it might be responsible, for the increase in accidents. However, you're right. What percentage of accidents happens in takeoff and landing compared to sort of mid-flight? That data's missing, because there's still the same number of takeoffs and landings. In actual flight, you could argue there's less in cross-country flight, because if you're making a 4-hour cross-country journey, say, for example, that's a long one, isn't it? But let's say let's say it was a 2-hour cross-country journey then. In 2 hours, you've got one takeoff and landing, whereas if you're at an airfield for 2 hours, you might actually take off and land 4 or 5 times. So,
absolutely.
So this is data. BHPA, let's get this data out. Send me the data. I'd love to get my teeth stuck into some of this.
That'd be really good to see, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. But the number of accidents is going up. So what about then, what do you think, Dan, about safety of paramotoring compared to paragliding? What's your thoughts on that?
I would hazard a guess that paramotoring is likely safer in the flying aspect, but when it comes to equipment, probably more dangerous, simply because, we've had in the past a lot of people ground starting. Hopefully that's been phased out by most people nowadays, so you've got that chance of injury there on the ground, whereas I would have thought the actual flying is probably safer for paramotoring, because you've got essentially a free thermal on your back. You don't need to hunt out thermals midday where it's going to be quite choppy air, or you're not flying close to terrain unless you fancy being a bit of speed flying. But I would have thought that paragliding, you've got a higher risk, because you have to hunt out those thermals and fly ridges to get your lift and essentially have those 2-hour flights, whereas you could do that quite easy by squeezing the trigger on your paramotor. Is that fair to say, Shaun? Do you think that's right? Do the figures show that that's true? Or
Dan, nobody likes a smart arse. You know that, don't you? Especially from a young whippersnapper and things like that. But yeah, I think you've hit it bang on from the data that I'm seeing. Now, we'll say there's a popular website that gives out statistics. I won't give them a mention, because I've dissed the BHPA. I don't want to diss somebody else, but on that website, they inaccurately state that paramotoring is safer than paragliding, and that apparently is not borne out by the literature at all. So again, as you know, I like my medically related papers. That is my game. So this was produced in 2014. It was published in the British Medical Journal on paramotoring, and its accidents and injuries related to powered paragliding, another cross-sectional study. I know this paper. I know it quite well, because I've posted this before on Reddit, and I've discussed it before in the past. But the paper clearly states here that the number of fatal accidents in powered paragliding, and I guess that's the marker they were looking at there, is not lower than in paragliding and in hang gliding,
really?
Which is interesting, because I always thought hang gliding was super, and people have told me that, but the data is not holding that out at all. Now, again, without quoting every little bit, there is evidence that suggests that you're absolutely right, that the midair flying tends to be slightly safer with paramotoring for the reasons that you said. You're limited to sort of your flying days, aren't you? And the paragliders are even more limited. So they tend to take more risks with weather. They have to jump off mountains. I mean, you can get towed, but they generally jump off mountains that carry inherent risk with rotor, turbulence, topography, all those kind of things. Whereas a paramotorist, because there are more opportunities for flying, you can basically drive down half an hour away to a field and take off with a paramotor. You don't have to arrange this big journey to drive off, to go off into the Peak District and things like that. There are more opportunities to fly, so you tend to pick safer opportunities. You will tend to fly, when the weather's safer, when there's a little bit less wind and such like. So the actual flying is safer. What's more dangerous, it seems, is danger from two things. One is the danger from the actual engine itself and the propeller, but also the weight on landing. You're more likely to damage lower limbs.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, so here in power paragliding, 44.5% of injuries was related to the upper limb. That's nearly half, 44.5% upper limb injuries. So, and a lot of those are prop strikes. But, there are other upper limb injuries because people fall over with a heavy paramotor on the back, and then they do what's called fall with an outstretched hand, which we in the trade call. Yep. And that's known as foosh, fallen on an outstretched hand. Yep. So foosh. So that's a foosh injury, and so they're quite common. Lower limbs as well. That's that's your legs. for those who don't know, 32%. So 32% of paramotoring injuries affects the lower limbs. It's quite interesting. The back is only 9.8%. It's still, it's 1 in 10ish, isn't it? But the back's not the major problem. The head's relatively low at 7%, and I will say that's also borne out by the BHPA's analysis as well, where they felt as though head injury now was becoming relatively insignificant. And the reason for that being, Dan, because you're the smart ass whippersnapper.
Probably wearing helmets, I'd have thought.
Yeah.
Apart from when you plaster them with GoPros and stuff.
That's right. Well, that brings me on to something else. That was something that I was taught. Again, when I was learning to fly, I always remember feeling that my instructor, Matt Fox, was a grumpy old bugger, and he's not that old and stuff. And it turns out he wasn't, because I was there as as this new paramotor pilot or paramotor student, wanting to get as much footage as I could for my YouTube channel, as you do. And he's like, "No, mate, you're not wearing that," because that's my Australian accent. "You ain't wearing that GoPro on your helmet, mate." And I'm like, "Why not?" I know, mate, it's a safety issue, but it really is, because it's like
it is, yeah.
You get those lines stuck in your helmet and things, and I was really he didn't like me getting the camera out. I remember, and at the time I was like, "Oh bloody hell, I want to get as much footage as possible."
Yeah.
But everything that he said was completely right, even from the Then I wanted the camera in my pocket to take it out and video, and he's like saying, "No, mate, I'll go through the prop." And he was right, But yeah, cameras on the bloody helmet, mate. What do you reckon to that, eh?
Well, I mean, look at Michael Schumacher. I think he was skiing with a GoPro on, was he? And then he was in a coma for God knows how long. I think they attributed his fall and the GoPro to that, didn't they? Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
I don't know. I mean, obviously I know Schumacher, and I know he ended up in a bad way because of his accident, but I didn't realise the GoPro had been cited as the problem. But
yeah, I think they sort of pointed the finger in that direction, that because it was attached to the side of the helmet, when he fell on it, it was a point of impact, so it's almost like a sharp object going in, really. So that's definitely a consideration for if you're going to wear a GoPro on your helmet, as well as just it being a snag hazard anyway.
Yeah, well, do you know, I got a bit of footage when I was learning to fly, because I stuck them in my videos. Do you know how I did that, Dan?
Snuck it in.
No, well, I put a chest cam on and then put a jacket over the top and zipped it up so you couldn't see it. And then when I got up to height, I unzipped my jacket, and started the camera.
We're our own worst enemies, really, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, dear.
And it makes you wonder what the safety profile of a YouTuber is, because how much time do you bugger about, with your camera equipment and things like that, when you should be concentrating on your flying?
Yeah, I was going to come on to this, so I'm glad you said that. Do you think that paramotoring makes you a bit lazier of a pilot because you haven't got to seek out the thermals and look where you're going all the time, as opposed to paraglider pilots? They've got to physically keep their mental, concentration on where's the lift coming from, how can I stay up and buoyant, whereas we like I said earlier, we just squeeze the trigger and we go. Do you think that makes us more lazy? I kind of think it does.
Well, it's interesting because Anthony Vella mentioned this, if you remember, in last week's podcast. For anybody that's not heard that, the awesome Anthony Vella was a guest of the show last week. Check out that podcast. But he was talking about us being paramotor pilots in the UK, and he just saw himself as a paramotorist, because he didn't feel the association with being a pilot. He just kind of felt as though he's floating around with a fan on his back. And maybe he's right in a way that a lot of people flying paramotors don't see it as aviation. I kind of do that. I'll be honest with you. I see paramotoring as aviation, and I see that it should attract the same kind of standards and skills that you would expect of any kind of a pilot. But I suspect there's a lot of people out there who just don't see it like that at all. And I think reading some of the comments I've seen in some of the social media and some of the arrogance that you see now and again in there, probably does allude towards that, Dan, that some people don't have that same, I don't know, professionalism's the wrong word, isn't it? But I think some people just are kind of, lazy. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, and you do see some people who think they're above the law in a certain sense for paramotoring. And it's strange, Sean. Like, sometimes I see paramotoring as, full on aviation. Oh, I've got this airspace here and I've got to pay attention to this. And other times I see it more as sort of like, going out on like a motorbike or something like that, and just having a sort of a bit of a bimble round and not taking it as seriously. I think I get a bit complacent, is probably the right word for it, when I know the area and I'm just either like, doing a bit of comp training or testing out like a new app or something like that. So yeah, it's interesting that I kind of see it in a few different lights, and I can see how easy it would be for people to just disregard it as proper aviation, which it is. We are bound by air law.
It also makes you wonder whether there's a Dunning-Kruger effect that goes on with paramotoring.
Oh, definitely.
And do you know, I do feel very definitely as if there was with me, because I think when I first started paramotoring, it was all confidence and no bloody skill. And then I hit this dip, and I really did, and that was post me having an accident, which I'll tell you about in a little while. But
yeah.
After that accident really knocked the wind out of my sails.
It wakes you up, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it reminds me, I heard Woody mention this on one of his videos, talking about something else once, talking about a fear injury. And I always found that concept, never heard that before. I found it fascinating that my main injury from that accident was the fear that happened afterwards. Right. But I realised that that's kind of the Dunning-Kruger, because if you see with Dunning-Kruger, if you see some of the graphs to do with it, you start off with this high confidence but low ability, and then your confidence, when you realise suddenly that your ability is shockingly poor after you've spent years and months, if not years, believing that you're a you're a superstar, and using the word super there very carefully. That you, because some people never actually get beyond the first Dunning-Kruger arrogance, do they? But then you end up in this, what they call the well of despair. Yeah. And, where you kind of, oh my God, I'm really useless at this, and what a tit I've been making of myself and things. And then it's a slow climb out of that to confidence, but that confidence then comes with experience and things. And I guess I'm on that journey now. I'm not far for the bottom of the well of despair, but climbing up. And I think that happens in paramotoring. And I think there are so many people out there that are at that first stage of super confidence and very, very low ability.
There's definitely a Dunning-Kruger effect. And you see it all the time, newer pilots at the airfield, that they're like, oh yeah, I can do all this stuff now. They have a scare, and then all of a sudden they're back to, oh yeah, maybe I should be a bit more careful. And like you said, you've experienced it. I've definitely experienced it. Like my instructor, Mike Chilvers, said to us, probably on one of the first few days, you've got two bags. One's a bag of luck and one's a bag of skill. You better hope that your bag of skill fills up before your bag of luck empties. It's so true, because it's so easy to get overconfident with flying because it's such a rush, and it's not really that difficult to do. Once you've got your ground handling to do and you're launching, the rest seems quite easy until you do scare yourself, like you're saying. So what was your scare you had, Shaun?
Yeah, so I've done a video on this. It's not a great video, but I did a bit of a brief video on it, and it's basically what happened. I was out ground handling. I mean, this was just it. This was ground handling, and I was strapped into to the wing that I've been ground handling forever. It was my own wing, my own Roadster 2. I'd got no paramotor on my back or anything. And it was really bizarre, because what happened is I got used to this wing. I must have spent, well over 10 hours ground handling it at this stage. And suddenly, the wing, when I'd kind of got the A's in my right hand and the D's in my left hand, and I got pushing the A's as far forward as possible. And normally the wing just sits on the ground, and something started to happen, and the wing started to sit up, to stand and make a wall, even though I'd got my hands forward. And when things, I don't know how to explain it, but when you get used to things working in a certain way, these little alarm bells go off when it's not doing what it's told and what's supposed to happen. And I can remember thinking, what's going on here? I really then tried hard to push the A's forward and really sort of sit the wing back and pull backwards on the brakes, and the wing wouldn't go back down on the ground. And I was just about to stop turning the wing, to turn it into sort of the wind, to sort of deep out and get rid of it, because I didn't like it. I like just to be able to left hand into my chest, right hand forward, and the bloody wing just collapse and it wasn't. And I was just starting to turn, and the wing just inflated, slap. I mean, I heard it almost flap like that. And it just shot across the ground, pulling me. And it dragged me. God, it must have been, it felt like 100 meters, and I really was being just dragged along the ground. Luckily, it was along the ground, and it dragged, the worst things that happen is it pulled the brake lines. I said it pulled the brake lines out. It didn't. I dropped them, mate. That was, I was like, oh, gee, and I just kind of let go of these bloody brake lines in the, shit, what's happening? So I'm hurling across the ground, and I remember trying then to grab hold of the brake lines on one side. I did, to sort of pull the wing in to get hold of the wingtip, and I kind of got it halfway in. And I felt as though I was slowing down, because I was still scooting across the ground. And then it reinflated. It pulled the lines out of my hand, burnt. I got all these blister burns on my hand, pulled it out again. And I looked down at my arm. I could see all blood all over my arms and things. And I kind of knew that I was in trouble. And so I grabbed hold again of the lines, pulled harder this time, and grabbed hold of the wingtip. And as soon as I did that and pulled the wing in, it just all deflated. And apparently what had happened, I mean, I didn't know, but there was another guy at the airfield who had come bombing after me and stuff, said it was a dust devil. And this was in Australia, mate. So it was like a thermal dust devil. And it had picked up and just grabbed hold of the wing and took it with me.
Wow.
I mean, and that, it shook me up, because it made me, I just thought, flying's the danger, but this wing here just does what I tell it to do. And I developed a few, I say skills, very low level skills, but still enough skills you would think to handle the wing. And it just showed me the power and the danger, even in this wing, and that was my fear injury.
Wow. I mean, Mother Nature's got a way of teaching you a lesson sometimes, doesn't she? I mean,
well, she pulled my pants down and smacked me arse that day, mate. Yeah, that's...
It sounds terrifying. I don't know if I'd attribute that to a Dunning-Kruger effect, because you're not doing anything. You weren't like trying to do anything smart. It would just, it just picked up and got you. But I think you're right. It's like the fear of the damage that you'd done previously.
And I've reflected so many times on that. I think, the one lesson I got out of that is don't let go of the brake. If I'd have just hold on to one brake and wrapped it round my hand and just pulled and pulled and pulled on one brake, it would bring the tip in. Thank goodness it was a big open field. I can't believe if they were dragging me over rocks or, things like that, it would have caused me a lot of injury. I was just dragged on my elbows, basically, on my face, just being dragged across the ground.
But that goes back to a similar situation that I was saying when I was doing wingovers earlier in the podcast, that you pick the location you're going to do these things to minimize the amount of risk, don't you?
Oh, you try to, and then and then learn from these things.
Yeah.
But it made me a very nervous pilot afterwards. It knocked the confidence out of me, and to be quite honest with you, but maybe then it gave me a healthier respect of what was going on, and maybe it'll be that, hopefully, touch wood, he says, to keep me safe. And I think it's pilots who don't have that, who have the arrogance, that Dunning-Kruger arrogance at the beginning. Maybe they're the ones that are likely to get hurt. And which brings me into another statistic. Then this is again the BHPA. A little bit of self-promotion in this for the BHPA, but looking at their accident statistics. So according to the BHPA statistics, between 2016 and 2018, there were 8 fatal paramotor accidents, not paragliding, paramotor, okay, PPG. And only one of them, read into this how you will, but only one of these was a BHPA member. And of course, you can only be a BHPA member if you've done the training. So I thought that was a staggering statistic, that 7 out of 8 people killed by a paramotor between 2016 and 2018 had not had BHPA formal training.
I mean, going through the BHPA system myself, I can vouch for it being a very thorough system, but, it doesn't ever account for, and nor does any training syllabus, what you then do after your training. Like, I keep going back to it. I went out and did those wingovers on my own intuition. I went and did that, but that's not what you're taught to do, unless you're physically seeking out like an acro course, or going and doing an SIV to understand how your wing will collapse and recover. Like that. It's an interesting figure, and it'd be quite interesting to see how that is like this year, once we've got through this year, because last year was a bit of a funny year, so we kind of sort of put that one aside a little bit with COVID and stuff. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, with the higher uptake of the sport nowadays, what the statistic is nowadays.
Well, let me tell you something else again, 2016 to 2018, because we're going to come on to wing loading in a little bit, which you alluded to earlier. But 2 of those 8 pilots were killed in midair collisions. Yeah, so, so that's a fair amount of people. That's 25%.
My fear right there.
Yeah. When I did my training, which I think is very similar to the BHPA, I did mine in Australia. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, a lot of that was being taught how to avoid midair collisions. And it wasn't just avoiding midair collisions by, taking off at the right time, keeping, a good peripheral awareness, situational awareness around you. But it was also taught how to handle and manage things when they go wrong, so you don't hit other pilots. So, the whole idea behind how they trained you with an asymmetric collapse was to stick in that brake to prevent you from veering off your course sharply and flying into the paraglider who's next to you, or even into the mountain. These are the things that you wouldn't learn to do, are they, if you didn't take a course like you do with the BHPA?
Just out of interest, Shaun, you said it was 1 out of the 8. Do we know if any of the other 7 were in another training association, or whether they were just self-taught, or is that statistic there? Do you know?
It's not there because, of course, the BHPA just talks about its membership. It's not qualified in the data. Again, if a more thorough report might do, but again, I've dissed the report a little bit. Don't mean to be, but obviously somebody's put a lot of work into it anyway, and I don't know whether these are paid positions in the BHPA or whether they're volunteers. I don't know. But anyway, 2 were mid-air collisions. One was only a BHPA member, and yes, that doesn't tell us whether people hadn't had training of any other kind. One pilot was warming his engine on the ground, and it killed him.
Wow.
So one of the 8 was actually warming his engine on the ground. And again, what do they say, on the back or on the rack?
Exactly, and there's good reason for it, and there's still people nowadays that will argue that some motors are safe to start on the ground, and you just can't. Why would you ever have that risk? It goes back to reduce the amount of risk that there possibly is, and that's what ultimately makes it safer, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember watching a video of an instructor in the States. I won't mention his name. He likes guns and God as well, apparently, and flies paramotor, the Morris Minor of paramotors. I can remember a video where he was really dissing people who were alluding to the idea that paramotors were dangerous to ground start. That's not borne out by the statistics. In a couple of papers, including that from the BHPA, are warning us about starting on the ground, and I'll tell you a little bit more sort of about that in a minute. Just quickly then, 6 pilots who died, 6 of the 8 that died. So bearing in mind one died on the ground. All right, so this is actually 6 of 7 pilots. Were flying small gliders with high wing loading. And the wing loading was ranging from 6.6 to 7.7 square meters. I guess there's a bell curve on this, in that there will be an optimum safety wing for your weight. So I would imagine that if you're too light, because you mentioned before, the wing loading not being high enough, means you don't recover from the collapse quite so well, and you're more likely to collapse. You'll reach an optimum, but then the increased, wing loading causes more quick, dramatic collapses. And of course, you're talking about higher speeds, more energies, and things like that. I would read that as an optimum, but still, the pilots who died had high wing loadings. Now, this figure could be confounded. So I don't know if you know anything about statistics. Anybody listening out there, there's something that's called a confounder. So because there's a link between the two, doesn't mean there's causality. I'll give you an example of that. We know that people who drink more alcohol are more likely to die of lung cancer. Okay, so you'd think, oh my God, that means alcohol causes lung cancer. All right, you can see how that people would think that, but it's actually not true. It's linked. It doesn't mean it's caused. Now, the truth of it is that people who drink alcohol are more likely to smoke cigarettes. So it's the cigarettes that's causing the lung cancer, not the alcohol. But it's a linked statistic. Now, it might be the same with the high wing loading. So it might not actually be that the high wing loading itself is dangerous, but the people who are flying highly loaded wings are the ones who are flying faster and pushing the limit more. So maybe these are the adrenaline pilots. So it's not the wing that's killing them, it's the kind of flight behavior that's killing them. So again, that's something that you'd think would be studied a little bit more.
Sounds about right there, Shaun. As soon as you said it, I was like, it's probably the people flying, the snakes, the free rides, the warps, and doing that acro sort of stuff, because that's normally when you do find high wing load. If you're a beginner, you're not going to jump on like a 16-meter overloaded like wing, are you? You're going to fly something that's safe and sensible, and launching a high wing loaded wing and so small, it's such a quick takeoff that beginners, you'd be running for days and you'd have no legs left. So it tends to be, I think you're right. It's the flight profile that determines the people who fly those overload, unless you've got something totally wrong. And if you're like self-trained and you've got some wrong bit of information somewhere, even if you're not self-trained, these things, like, I think that'd be pretty rare, but Yeah, I would have thought it's people like doing the acro stuff or, high energy maneuvers.
Well, if I add to that statistic then that the 6 pilots who died with high wing loadings, all 6 occurred at low level. The trouble is, mate, is all deaths happen at low level, don't they? Really, they happen when you hit the ground. But
eventually, yeah.
I think what the statistic is saying is that these people were engaged in low level flight when things went wrong. So flying fast, high loaded wings at low level, and that brings us to what we said at the beginning, wasn't it? Those kind of the adrenaline junkie pilots. You're the ones running the risks.
Yeah, and does that make paramotoring unsafe is the real question, isn't it? Because it's definitely down to your flying style. Surely the figures have shown that today.
Well, I think so, definitely. Now, it's like I've said with anything, you cannot ameliorate all risk. Risk is inherent in anything that we do. Sat here right now, mate, who knows, one of the ceiling tiles might fall in and knock me on the head, and there's risk to everything. But it's control over that risk, and it sounds to me like most of the injuries are happening doing things that you can actually not do. So just going back quickly then to injuries of parts of the body, head was 7%. We talked about that. Pelvis is only 3.1%. Chest is 2.7%, and the abdomen 0.7%. Which is quite encouraging. Now we were talking about what causes the accidents in the paramotor. I'm going back to the 2014 paper, accidents and injuries related to power paragliding. 11.2% of injuries was caused by the engine. That's 11.2% of injuries to the upper limb, should I say, was caused by the engine itself. And we talked about that, didn't we? I think I could have squeezed that in. We said it's either a prop strike or it could be the Fouche injury. Power paragliding accidents are more common during, it's a quiz. Is it more common during takeoff or landing?
Ooh. God, well, you've always got to land.
Yep.
So I'm gonna go with
everybody lands somehow.
Everybody lands somehow. I want to say landing, but I've got a feeling, is it takeoff?
Oh, nobody likes a smart ass. I've told you that before.
There's
a reason, Daniel, you're called a young whippersnapper. It is indeed, yeah. So paragliding accidents are more common during takeoff.
Has there been a conclusion drawn to that? Is it because without taking off you can't land, or
well, no, I mean, because you assume there's the same number of takeoffs as landing.
Yeah.
Well, no, there isn't, is there? It's during takeoff. Yeah, actually, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because there are more takeoffs than landings. I guess it depends. Have you taken off or haven't you? If you're actually trying to take off and you have an accident, is that classed as a takeoff? I don't know. Now you see, you've made me question that statistic.
Well, yeah, we want that clarified. Is it an attempted takeoff? Was it an actual takeoff?
Is it an actual takeoff? Because you can have 100 attempted takeoffs for every one landing, couldn't you? You can if you fly from Fat Paramotor HQ. And I'm not going to mention any names. A few people like taking off from fences, don't they, around here? But
he'll appreciate that, Colin.
Yeah, I know, that's good. Well, I needed somebody to test the strength of the fence, but there we go.
He definitely did that, yeah.
Again, the paper suggested that the energy from the engine and the weight of the equipment may aggravate accidents. We touched on that before. There's no evidence to suggest that's what's happening. That's somebody's interpretation of the evidence. And here, this one is interesting, all right, because we talked about training or no training, but it says there's no statistically significant correlation was found in our sample between accident severity and the pilot rating.
That is interesting.
Now, this is interesting because then I think, well, does no rating count as a rating? Because I think I did have a look over some of the statistics, but I've not looked at the numbers hard. But I believe, and please don't shoot me down, anybody who reads the paper a bit harder, but But I believe these were just talking about rated pilots who have got, different PPG ratings, whether I don't know whether they club pilot and things like that here in the UK, aren't they? I'm not sure whether they use P1 and P2 like paragliding. I did see, and it suggested that somebody who was quite like instructors and things like that weren't actually any safer than people who were non-instructors.
Huh. That's strange.
That's interesting then, Giles. We'll have to have a look at that. So that means then we're not taking any kind of instruction anymore from Chile or Giles Fowler, are we? Is that right? Because now we've decided we're just as good as you. That's what the statistics say. But
that's what the statistics say, yeah.
I mean, let's just look at that a bit more clearly as well in the wording, though. It does say between accident severity. It doesn't actually say the number of accidents.
Right.
So it's the severity of the accident. That would then make me feel, do you have any control over how severe an accident is?
Well, yeah, well, I think it depends on the situation, really, isn't it? If you're pushing your envelope of comfort, say flying sort of midday and thermals and stuff on a paramotor, then maybe you're going to hit a thermal that's going to knock you sideways, and that could be more severe than sending off a lower airtime pilot in, say, 2 or 3 mile an hour wind.
This is interesting. Now, this is what makes statistics fun. It's how you interpret them. But it also could be that people generally fly to a certain percentage of their ability. So it evens out. So somebody who's an amateur is probably flying very, very safe, and they have the same number of severe accidents as somebody who is very experienced, but is flying a higher level of flying, but experiences the same number of severe injuries. So in actual fact, the experience balances out the more dangerous flying. Does that make sense? So that actually might be what the statistic is showing. The amateurs have the same number of severe injuries as the experts, but it might be because the experts are flying, I'll say more dangerously, but flying more expertly. Do you understand what I'm saying there, Dan?
Fly hard, live fast.
Fly hard, live fast.
Yeah, I do find myself, I'm definitely no expert, but pushing.
I know that, Dan. And that's why I invited you to be the co-host, so I look good.
Anyone will see that from the YouTube videos that I put out. And just going back to the Fat Paramotor HQ, everyone can check out everyone's launches from that on your channel as well, Shaun, can't they?
Yeah,
the Fat Paramotor guy. But I find myself pushing my envelope of flying because I'm training to do my first proper championship this year, and it comes with a lot more risk. I'm flying midday, there's gusts, launching and doing practice engine off at 500 feet. I haven't then got that extra bit of kick from a motor if I need to. I probably could restart the atom pretty quickly, but that's a lot more risky than a slower airtime pilot coming in for their final glide, killing their engine when they're definitely going to make the field. And they're not going on cross countries seeking out thermals. It does make sense, especially from my perspective at the moment.
And I think that's how I see that. I see this as you become more experienced, you enjoy more advanced flight to stay within the same safety window. To stay safe as a novice pilot, you're going to do very simple takeoff and landings, early morning, late evening, those kind of things, and the relative number of accidents is low. When you're an experienced pilot, you'll be doing far more advanced flying. You'll be flying all weathers, you'll be flying different distances, but your expertise then will result in the same relatively safe flying. So being more experienced doesn't mean you have less accidents. It probably means you can enjoy more advanced flying.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yes, all good stuff there. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about then, Dan, unless you've got any pearls of wisdom you'd like to bring our way, is paramotoring safer or not than riding a motorcycle?
Oh, now that's a good question. I hope you've got some stats on that, Shaun, because I quite often, when people ask how much is it and is this safe, I normally say, it's about the same price as buying a big sort of motorbikes, anywhere from like 600cc to 1,000 sort of job, and getting your license for that. And I normally say that paramotoring is as safe as you make it. It's probably safer than riding a motorbike because of all the other cars on the road nowadays. But prove me wrong. Am I wrong or am I right, Shaun, by saying that? Because I'm just going off of my own judgment there.
Yeah, well, the answer to that is nobody seems to know at the moment. So now, to be honest with you, I think I could have shed more light onto this if there would have been more data released by the BHPA on that paper. And in fairness, they might be. I don't know whether they've got the raw statistics and the raw data. Because I'm fairly limited. We do this for fun, Dan. I've got a career in things, but it would be nice to know, because I needed to know things like, number of pilots, pilot activity, and things like that. And I could have made a good comparison because there's a bit more data on motorcycles. But I wasn't unable to. Now, some people have made some rough estimates, and again, I'm looking at another website that's by paramotor enthusiasts. There's a lot of bias in this, so it's difficult to look. But I will take some of the numbers. They've used numbers from the United States, and they've made some very rough estimates of certain things, which is okay. You can do that sometimes in science. It's worth doing that to sort of have a look at things. If I take their numbers to be correct, they've said that looking at the statistics of motorcycles, of which there are far more numbers of motorcyclists, there is about 0.7 per every 1,000 participants ends up in a fatality with a motorcycle. So less than 0.7 per every 1,000.
Yeah.
And their estimate on this site, and I mean, I will say that, it's a bit mean of me to use their statistics, not actually mention them, even though I'm dissing a little bit, but it's Foot Flyer that I'm looking at. So, because I'm using their statistics, I think that it's respectful to sort of at least cite them in that. Now, they've also said that a paramotor then, based on their estimates, is 0.5 fatalities per 1,000 participants. Okay. So that would suggest, carefully, that it might be safer than motorcycling. However, there's a caveat, you see. This depends how you use statistics. You have to be very, very careful and how things are presented, especially to people who don't understand statistics, because people are very, very biased, interpretation bias, in how they see things. The issue with that is that more or less says, if you are active in paramotoring, for every 1,000 paramotorists, 0.5%, so 1 in every 2,000 paramotorists will die, okay? And I think that those are annual statistics. And with motorcycles, you're going to get 1.4 every 2,000 who are going to die. However, if you are an active paramotorist, how many hours do you actually fly compared to how much the average motorcycles, and what's the average number of flying hours somebody will do in a year? I bet it's not many. I bet, you're probably one of the higher. I don't know, Dan. A lot of people might do 2 hours every month. That's 24 hours of flying a year. And that might be the average. I don't know. It might be 30 hours a year. It might be 50 hours a year. But I would imagine that motorcyclists motorcycle a lot more, because usually it's a mode of transport. It's not just done for pleasure. So, you'd probably find people doing a lot more hours paramotoring. If you could fly your paramotor to work and back every day, Dan, you'd do a lot more hours than you do at the moment with it, wouldn't you?
I'd damn do it as well.
Yeah, you'd damn do it. So it's difficult to really compare. So you can say, well, owning a paramotor gives you an averaged risk of 0.5 per 1,000. But if you're only flying an hour a month and somebody else is flying 100 hours a month, then, if you look at that statistic, it's probably the person flying 100 hours who's carrying the risk. So if that person flying the paramotor was flying as many hours as the average motorcyclist, you might find that there was multiple times you're more likely to die from your paramotor. Now, I'm saying that only for one reason, just to show you that you can't interpret the data, not to suggest that paramotoring is that more dangerous. So, this is what I'm saying. You can't compare the two. So even though Footflyer have had a good go, I think there's bias in what they're saying. They've landed the bias in favour of, do you know what, paramotoring is safer than motorcycling. I don't think you can draw any conclusions from their guesstimates because the figures just aren't comparable in any way. And I think to actually answer that question, we need some harder data. And I do think I might be able to answer it a little bit better if we got some more data from the BHPA, and even, if we got some questionnaires about people's flying activity, how many hours they do and things like that. It would be quite interesting research.
Yeah, I think that'd make quite a good video as well for your channel, Shaun. I think we should get onto the BHPA and start dishing out those questionnaires. And there's some fairly active people on the Facebook forums and stuff like that. So you're not going to get every single pilot come back to you, but I think that'd be enough of a group to draw a conclusion from, at least look at it.
Yeah, you just need a representative sample, that's all, when you're doing statistics. Yeah,
that's what I was trying to get at.
So that would be good. So in summary then, we've decided that listen, paramotoring can be relatively safe, but you make it dangerous depending on the amount of flying that you do, that you can ameliorate the risk of flying the same as riding a motorcycle, the same as driving a car, by training, getting experience, being sensible, listening to advice, those kind of things. So you can ameliorate risk. We don't know whether it's more dangerous than motorcycling. Paramotoring, the danger tends to be the ground, taking off, and prop strikes. So I think that's it. Anything else we've took from that, Dan?
No, I think that's everything, Shaun. We've gone through, we've given our own experiences, we've looked at the data, and I think you can't really argue with that. Let's hope we get some more data soon so we can hopefully revisit this as well and get some hard facts.
Let's do that indeed. So brilliant. So anyway, Dan. Oh, it's been fantastic again, hasn't it? Do you know, I do love these chats and stuff. So this was the Fat Paramotor podcast. Not even the podcast. This was the Fat Paramotor podcast. In the studio, Daniel Jones, of course. Don't forget to check Daniel Jones out. He's got an absolutely amazing YouTube channel. He's been doing some video series on cross-country flying recently. I was the Fat Paramotor guy. Check out my YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye, Dan.
See you all soon.